A spine-chilling 30 seconds unfolded in a dark, pressure-filled courtroom. The arrogant fury and blatant contempt of a wealthy white billionaire faced off against the cold, steel gaze and the gavel of justice, wielded by a black female judge whose presence shook the world. Will evil, violence, and racial injustice be crushed, or will the powerful continue to trample over everything? In this high-stakes drama, the courtroom seemed to freeze in a tense silence. No one spoke. No murmurs dared to break the heavy atmosphere that enveloped the room. Under the dim light, anxious, nervous, and shocked faces all focused intently on one person. William Sterling, the infamous billionaire, the ruler of financial empires. He sat with his arms crossed, his eyes full of arrogance, staring at the judge's bench as though he was watching a trivial play. He didn't rise. He didn't bow his head. There was not a hint of respect for the one who would soon pass judgment on him. The back door swung open, and Judge Evelyn Hayes entered. She walked in with an air of dignity, each step echoing sharply on the wooden floor, as if every rhythm affirmed her position. For the first time in history, a black woman sat at the highest seat of this courtroom, a fact that made many proud, yet some still held contempt. William Sterling was one of them. Everyone in the courtroom immediately stood. Lawyers, jurors, reporters, even the officers standing beside them all rose in unison. But among this sea of formality, only one person remained seated, arms crossed, as if he were an emperor in his own palace. A smirk of disdain spread across William's face, and immediately the room fell into a state of unease. A few whispered among themselves, their eyes nervously scanning the room. Court staff exchanged silent, worried glances. News cameras from various outlets captured every tension-filled moment. Judge Evelyn Hayes didn't rush to react. She simply gazed at William Sterling, her eyes neither angry nor confused, but cold and piercing, as if she had anticipated this spectacle long ago. A long silence stretched on, feeling endless, and then her voice rang out, calm yet full of authority. Mr. Sterling, in this courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters. William Sterling's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes glinting with challenge. Not today. His voice was low, deliberate, and he emphasized each word. And certainly not because of you. The room seemed to choke. A frantic whisper ran through the audience. A young attorney swallowed hard, glancing nervously at a colleague. For the first time, someone dared to openly disrespect a judge in the middle of court. But Evelyn Hayes remained unfazed. She didn't flinch, didn't show anger, nor did she react in the way William Sterling had hoped. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were a puzzle with a solution already known. Then, very slowly, she reached for the gavel on the table. No one could predict what would happen next, but in that moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. The air in the courtroom became thick, like the calm before an explosive storm. Every person in the room, from the lawyers to the jury, had their eyes locked on two figures, the embodiment of justice and power in direct confrontation. Evelyn Hayes, a black woman whose very presence in the highest chair of the court was both a victory and a challenge to the establishment, stood unwavering, poised as a symbol of the law. Across from her, William Sterling, the billionaire magnate who believed his wealth and influence made him untouchable, sat with a look of cold, arrogant defiance, his every movement laced with disdain. Evelyn's gaze never wavered as she placed the gavel down on the podium with deliberate care. The small yet thunderous sound seemed to cut through the thick silence that had taken over the room. With the eyes of every soul in the room upon her, she spoke, her voice low and steady, yet carrying the weight of unshakable authority. "Mr. Sterling, stand up." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but instead of complying, William Sterling merely let out a loud, mocking laugh. The sound was sharp and dismissive, reverberating throughout the room like a slap to everyone's sense of decorum. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his legs spread wide, looking every bit the arrogant king of his own domain. He stared at Evelyn as if daring her to confront him. "I'm not getting up for you, Judge," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not today, and certainly not because of you." His words seemed to hang in the air, defying the very foundation of respect upon which the court was built. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the reality of his insolence sank in. The whispers started almost immediately. The elderly men and women in the room, Those who had fought their entire lives for civil rights, for equality, gripped the arms of their chairs in a mix of shock and fury. Their faces, weathered with years of battles, now twisted with disbelief and outrage. Their hands clenched, and a subtle tension crept into the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. William Sterling's insolence had lit a fuse, and everyone knew it. But Evelyn Hayes remained perfectly composed. She didn't flinch. She didn't show anger. She didn't react as William Sterling had hoped. Her gaze stayed cold, calculating, as if she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. This wasn't her first time facing down the powerful and the privileged, those who believed that money, wealth, and influence could shield them from the law. She had seen men like Sterling before, men who lived in ivory towers and thought the rules didn't apply to them. But there was one thing they all failed to understand. Evelyn Hayes was not someone who could be intimidated. The moments stretched on in silence, and the tension was palpable. No one dared to speak. The court staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how their judge would respond to such a blatant challenge. They watched, breathless, as Evelyn remained perfectly still, the weight of her presence growing heavier with each passing second. She didn't rush. She didn't have to. William Sterling, on the other hand, began to think that perhaps he had the upper hand. A satisfied smirk played across his lips as he leaned back further in his chair, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He thought he had broken her. He thought he had made his point clear. No one could touch him, not even the law. He had money, he had power, and no one would dare stand in his way. But Evelyn Hayes had no intention of backing down. Her hands remained poised on the table, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she reached for the gavel. The room held its breath as she gripped it firmly, her fingers tightening around the handle until her knuckles turned white. There was a quiet, almost electric anticipation in the air, as if the room itself was holding its collective breath. Then, in one swift motion, Evelyn brought the gavel down. Bam! The sound of the gavel striking the wood was deafening, like a gunshot echoing through the courtroom. The impact rattled the air, and for a split second, it felt as if the entire room had been struck by lightning. The room froze. Even William Sterling's arrogant smirk faltered for a moment as the sound reverberated in his chest. The force of it seemed to shake him out of his self-assured stance, if only for a fleeting second. "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn Hayes said, her voice now full of icy authority, "if you cannot show respect for this court, I promise you, there will be consequences." Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of a promise. There was no anger in her tone, but a quiet, unyielding power that made every person in the room sit up straighter, aware that they were witnessing something far greater than just a courtroom showdown. This was a moment of reckoning. For the first time since entering the courtroom, William Sterling's smile began to fade. The fleeting doubt, the brief flicker of uncertainty, crossed his face like a shadow. It was subtle, but it was there. It was enough for anyone who was paying attention to notice. This was not the control he had thought he had. In that moment, Evelyn Hayes knew exactly what she was doing. She had tested him, and now he knew this was a battle he could not win. The tables had turned, and for the first time, William Sterling began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a grave mistake, a mistake that would cost him far more than he had ever imagined. The sound of Evelyn Hayes's gavel still echoed through the space, her warning words striking deep into the minds of everyone present. William Sterling, the man who always believed he could manipulate anyone, suddenly lost some of the confidence in his gaze. He no longer smiled, or at least the smug smirk that once adorned his face had faded significantly. But someone like William Sterling wouldn't easily accept being outmaneuvered. He took a deep breath, his hand clenched tightly around the armrest of his chair, and then leaned back, trying to regain the calm, controlled air of someone in charge. "Consequences," he repeated, his voice slow and deliberately mocking. "Do you think I'm afraid, Judge Hayes?" A low murmur rippled through the room as some shook their heads in disbelief at his stubbornness. But Evelyn didn't react immediately. She just stared at him, her eyes no longer just those of a judge, but of someone who embodied justice, ready to confront those who thought the law didn't apply to them. Then, very slowly, she lifted the gavel again. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew even more tense, the kind of tension that made one feel as if they could hear every heartbeat pounding in their chest. A few young attorneys swallowed nervously. A reporter silently adjusted their camera angle, feeling like they were about to capture a moment that could change the entire course of the trial. "Mr. Sterling, stand up immediately." This time, Evelyn's voice was colder than before, leaving no room for him to wiggle out of the situation. William Sterling squinted at her, staring for a long moment as if trying to read his opponent. But instead of standing, he smiled faintly, then crossed his arms again, leaning back in his chair with an even more defiant posture. "No." His mocking laughter rang out into the heavy silence, as if daring anyone to challenge him. That response wasn't just defiance. It was an insult, a declaration that he didn't respect the law, nor did he respect anyone with the authority to judge him. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. In this courtroom, he was not the one in control. The gavel came down with the force of a gunshot, and the room seemed to vibrate from the impact. "William Sterling, you have just disrespected this court. I order your immediate arrest." Evelyn's command rang out with the certainty of an irreversible judgment. The entire room erupted. Some people exhaled in shock. Others turned to each other in disbelief at what they had just heard. But the person who reacted most intensely was William Sterling. He shot up from his chair, eyes wide with fury, his anger flaring violently. "How dare you?" "I will." But he never finished his sentence. Two police officers had already moved in from either side. In the blink of an eye, they seized his arms, yanking him out of his seat. "Get off me!" William roared, violently jerking back, but the officers held firm. One of them leaned in close, speaking softly yet with unshakable resolve. "No one is above the law, Sterling." His chair was violently knocked to the floor with a loud crash. The cameras swiftly panned, capturing every second of this unprecedented scene. William Sterling, the powerful billionaire, being dragged out of the courtroom like an ordinary criminal. He struggled, but there was no escape. All eyes were on him, witnessing the fall of a symbol of arrogance and abuse of power right before their eyes. And outside this room, the whole world was watching. This battle had only just begun. The sound of Evelyn Hayes's gavel still echoed in the minds of those present in the courtroom. But to truly understand why that moment was so groundbreaking, we need to turn back 24 hours, when William Sterling was still at the pinnacle of power, when he still believed that no one could touch him. The morning sky cast a light blue hue over the city, the towering skyscrapers reflecting the glint of the sun. But inside a lavish mansion at the heart of the financial district, William Sterling paid no attention to that beauty. He stood before a large glass window, his cold, sharp eyes sweeping over the cityscape that he viewed as his personal chessboard, where he was the one holding the strongest piece. In the luxurious living room behind him, the powerful figures of finance and politics sat, the atmosphere thick with quiet tension. Those who had once fawned over him, flattered him, now appeared uneasy as the news of the upcoming trial flashed continuously across the large screen. They knew that this time, William Sterling was facing something that his wealth could not buy his way out of. William turned around, his gaze scanning each person in the room. He then picked up a glass of wine from the table, took a sip, and chuckled. "What are you all afraid of?" he asked, his voice drawn out, full of mockery. "A trial? A black female judge thinks she can judge me." No one dared speak immediately. But then Marcus Thorne, his personal lawyer, leaned forward, his voice lowered with caution. "William, this is different. Judge Hayes is not someone who can be bought or threatened. She is a symbol in the judicial system. The entire country is watching this case." William paused for a moment, but then laughed even louder, the sound echoing through the room as if he had just heard the most ridiculous story. He put his glass down, his gaze growing cold. "Bought? Threatened? Why would I bother with such petty things?" He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I don't need to buy anyone off, Marcus. I just need to crush them before they even think about showing their claws." A heavy silence enveloped the room. The people seated there, those who had seen him obliterate countless rivals in the past, knew that William Sterling never joked when he spoke like this. But Marcus was not easily swept up in the frenzy of power. He slowly inhaled deeply, then placed a stack of files on the table before William. "William, this time it's different. They have evidence, lots of evidence. Financial documents, shady transactions, phone calls you thought were hidden. The FBI doesn't act unless they're sure they can convict you." William tightened his grip on the wine glass, but instead of panicking, he just scoffed. He stood up straight, picked up the file, flipped through a few pages as if it held no real meaning. "Evidence," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Marcus, have you forgotten the rules of the game? I don't need to argue with evidence. I rewrite the rules of the game." Marcus fell silent, staring at him. But before he could respond, William threw the file down on the table and reached for his phone. "Call the media team," he ordered, his eyes still glued to the TV screen where Judge Evelyn Hayes had just appeared in an early morning news segment. "Tell them to start the campaign immediately. I want public opinion in my hands before the trial even begins. If they want a game, I'll show them who writes the script." Marcus sighed but nodded. William Sterling turned back to the window, this time raising his glass like a declaration of victory. He had never lost, and he didn't believe this time would be any different. But little did he know, 24 hours later, everything would be turned completely upside down. William Sterling had just set his wine glass down when his phone vibrated, a call from his personal assistant. He picked up the phone slowly, his face still calm, as if he had known everything would unfold exactly as he wanted. But the frantic voice on the other end made him freeze. "William, they're coming. The FBI is on their way up to your floor." The entire room seemed to freeze. The powerful men who had been discussing things with him moments before now exchanged nervous glances. Some started standing up, silently retreating toward the door as if they had never been there. Marcus Thorne set his glass down, his face drained of color. "William, we have to leave now." But William Sterling didn't move. He looked out the window, his eyes flashing with defiance. "Do they really think they can come in here and drag me out?" He laughed, a dry, hollow laugh full of arrogance. He had always believed that money could bend the law, that no one dared touch him. And so, he stayed seated, with no intention of leaving. Then the door slammed open, and everything changed. A group of FBI agents stormed in, their dark suits and metallic badges glinting in the light. "William Sterling, you are under arrest for financial fraud, insider trading, and bribing officials." One agent's voice rang out, firm and unyielding. "Put your hands in front of you." Marcus took a step back, but William showed no sign of panic. He sat still, his eyes scanning the agents, then inhaled deeply. Slowly, he rose to his feet, not in submission, but in the posture of a betrayed king. "So you actually dare?" William scoffed, his voice cold as he extended his hands forward. But it wasn't because he was ready to cooperate. It was because he wanted the world to see that he was still in control. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, the sound reverberating through his lavish room, a moment that no one could believe was actually happening. As the agents dragged him down the opulent hallway, the elevator doors opened, revealing a scene that truly enraged him. Reporters, crowds, cameras, all waiting. William Sterling, in his expensive suit with his hands cuffed in front of him, was on the screens of millions in an instant. Flashing lights went off in a frenzy, and the reporters' voices rang out relentlessly. "William Sterling, do you have any comments on the upcoming trial? Did you really defraud billions of dollars?" But William didn't lower his head. He spun around sharply, his eyes burning with fury, his voice booming with defiance. "Do you really think you can bring me down? This system doesn't run without me. You'll all be bowing down eventually." Some reporters fell silent. Others shook their heads in disgust. But for the older individuals watching on their screens, the ones who had fought for justice, this sight only fueled their anger further. William Sterling wasn't just rich. He believed the law was a game he created, one where he never lost. But this time, as he was forced into the FBI vehicle and the door slammed shut, he had no choice but to face the trial awaiting him ahead. And with every passing second, his power was crumbling. The FBI van carrying William Sterling sped through the crowded streets. But the truth was, he couldn't escape the gaze of the entire world. The moment the van's door slammed shut, hundreds of photos were snapped and spread like wildfire. William Sterling, the man who had once graced the cover of Forbes with a smug grin, now looked like a cornered animal. His suit was wrinkled, his once perfect hair slightly disheveled. But what stood out the most was his gaze. Wild, bitter, but with a fleeting glimpse of worry. In just a few hours, the world began to pay attention. Major news outlets, from CNN to BBC, from prestigious financial newspapers to tabloid websites, ran with the story. Sensational headlines flooded every platform. Billionaire William Sterling arrested by FBI. Financial empire collapsing. William Sterling no longer untouchable. Can justice finally prevail? On social media, millions of comments exploded, half still loyal to him. the other half furious over his arrogance for so many years. But what truly shifted wasn't just the fact that a billionaire had been arrested. It was how the audience began to empathize with the nameless people he had trampled on for years. The employees he fired without reason, the small businesses crushed by his monopolistic deals, the people who lost their savings to his financial manipulation suddenly. The victims who had long been forgotten were back in the spotlight. A middle-aged woman choked up on a live TV broadcast, speaking about how her father lost his entire fortune to a scam orchestrated by William Sterling. A former employee from Sterling's corporation appeared on a podcast, sharing the fear of speaking out against him. And then a question began to spread across news sites, talk shows, and social media posts. Will justice truly be served? How many times before had people like William Sterling gotten away with their crimes? He had enough money to hire the best lawyers, enough connections to manipulate the system, and enough power to control public opinion. But this time, as the image of him being dragged away in handcuffs dominated the front pages, everything seemed different. In the judge's office on the highest floor of the federal courthouse, soft yellow light filtered over the law books lining the walls, creating a space that was both imposing and suffused with pressure. Evelyn Hayes sat behind her dark wood desk, her calm eyes scanning the file in front of her. The documents inside were filled with evidence, testimony, and a name boldly printed at the top of the first page: William Sterling. She was not surprised to see that name before her. Throughout her life, she had witnessed men like him, rich white men who believed they could rewrite the rules of the game as they saw fit. But what made her pause wasn't William Sterling himself. It was the fact that this event was unfolding in front of the entire nation. She knew very well this was not just any trial. It was a battle between justice and power. Evelyn placed her hand on the file and gave a small, cold smile, sharp, calculated, with no trace of doubt or fear. "He won't buy me," she said, her voice firm, like a declaration, like a verdict already written. Her words echoed in the quiet room like a spark igniting within those who had long been familiar with injustice. Outside the courthouse, older generations were watching, those who had witnessed countless cases where men like William Sterling had walked free, those who had seen justice twisted by money. But when they looked at this woman, they saw a flicker of hope, a chance for the legal system to truly stand on the side of right. Evelyn was no stranger to being underestimated. Her entire career had been a series of battles against prejudice, against the doubtful stares, against those who thought a black woman couldn't hold a seat like this. But she had done it, and now, she wasn't just defending justice. She was defending the faith of those who had lost hope in it. She stood, walking to the window, looking down at the street below. There, dozens of reporters were gathered, waiting for every twist of the trial. Farther away, in homes, cafes, and on every small screen, millions were watching to see if this system was still worthy of their trust. Evelyn clenched her hands behind her back, took a deep breath, then returned to her desk. If William Sterling thought he could do whatever he pleased, he was wrong. She pulled the file closer, flipped to the first page, her eyes filled with determination. His game was over. Inside his high-end law office, William Sterling slammed his fist onto the table. The wine glass shook as the rich red liquid spilled over the glass's edge, reflecting the golden light of the luxurious surroundings. His face was dark with anger, no longer holding the smug half-smile he had worn when the FBI dragged him away in handcuffs. He was truly furious now. Marcus Thorne, his personal lawyer, sat across from him, his hands clasped together on the table, trying to maintain a calm tone. "William, you can't use your old tricks this time. This isn't a financial negotiation. Evelyn Hayes isn't someone who can be bribed or threatened." William leaned back in his chair, laughing loudly, but there was bitterness and challenge in his laughter. "A black female judge," he emphasized each word, his lip curling with clear disdain. "Do they really think I'm going to stand before someone like her?" He gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with hatred. "I'll make her regret sitting in that chair." Marcus shut his eyes briefly, stifling a sigh. He had seen William's ruthlessness in the past, but this time, something was different. This time, he was facing a force that he couldn't fully control. But William didn't see it. He still believed he was invincible. He stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. But instead of fear, he was looking for a way to tear everything apart. "Listen to me." He spun around, his eyes gleaming with danger. "If this system thinks I'll kneel before her, they've forgotten who I am. He leaned forward, his voice lowering but cutting through the air like a knife. Marcus, I want all media outlets to attack her immediately. I want her past dug up. I want every decision she's ever made to be dissected. Marcus raised an eyebrow. William, be careful. If we go too far, public opinion could turn against you. William scoffed, reaching for the remaining glass of wine on the table. Public opinion? I've been manipulating public opinion for 2 decades. They'll believe whatever I want them to believe. But this time, he didn't know that there was one thing he couldn't control: Evelyn Hayes's unwavering resolve. And elsewhere, older viewers sat in front of their TV screens, witnessing William Sterling's brazen contempt, feeling more angered than ever. They had seen men like him before, rich, powerful men who thought they could trample the law without consequence. But this time, they hoped things would be different. This time, they placed their trust in Evelyn Hayes. The world seemed to hold its breath. The trial was broadcast live across all major television networks, with massive LED screens in Times Square airing footage from the courtroom, and millions of eyes fixed on one person, Judge Evelyn Hayes. From crowded coffee shops to small living rooms, from the towering buildings of Wall Street to working-class neighborhoods, everyone was watching a moment that could change history. Evelyn entered the courtroom with a calm, strong presence, yet one heavy with the weight of what was at stake. She knew the pressure on her was immense. This wasn't just a financial case. It was a direct confrontation between justice and power, a test of whether the law could still uphold fairness in the face of someone like William Sterling. The cameras were trained on her as she took her seat at the bench, the lights illuminating her resolute face, unshaken. Whispers spread across the room. Reporters snapped photos nonstop. Jurors exchanged worried glances. They knew they weren't just facing a defendant. They were facing an entire financial empire standing behind him. William Sterling entered from the other side of the room, no longer handcuffed, but his eyes still burned with anger and defiance. He scanned the room, locking eyes with Evelyn as if sizing her up, trying to determine whether she was truly worthy of being his adversary. But instead of looking away, Evelyn stared right back at him, unafraid, unwavering. Marcus Thorne, William's lawyer, stepped up to the defense table, adjusting his tie before speaking. Your Honor, my client is a respected citizen, a businessman who has contributed greatly to the economy. Evelyn raised her hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. Mr. Thorne, I trust you understand we are not here to discuss Mr. Sterling's contributions. We are here to determine whether he has broken the law. Her voice was sharp, leaving no room for any manipulation. In that moment, the world understood that this wasn't just another trial. This was going to be a no-holds-barred battle. Outside, crowds began to gather in increasing numbers. Some held up signs that read, "No one is above the law." Those who had lost everything due to William Sterling's decisions were watching every second, waiting to see if this time justice would truly be served. Evelyn felt the weight of the pressure on her shoulders, but she wouldn't let it make her falter. She gripped the wooden gavel tightly, looked around the room, and then spoke slowly, "Let's begin." And with those words, a storm officially erupted. The atmosphere in the courtroom was taut as a violin string as William Sterling walked in, no longer the one being escorted, but a man still brimming with arrogance and defiance. He strode slowly through the rows of seats, ignoring the people around him, yet it was clear that he knew every eye was fixed on him. Cameras followed his every movement, capturing his confident walk, his impeccably tailored suit, and the smirk of a man who still believed he held control. Evelyn Hayes sat at the bench, her eyes never leaving him. She had seen men like William Sterling before, powerful men who believed the law was a toy to be manipulated. But this time, she knew she would not let that game play out again. "Mr. Sterling," she spoke, her voice calm yet firm. "The court requires you to state your identity and acknowledge the charges against you." William Sterling stopped. A long silence followed, the entire courtroom holding its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. He turned his head slowly, meeting Evelyn's gaze, and then he laughed, a mocking, cold laugh, void of any fear. "I don't need to answer to you." The air shattered. Whispers erupted instantly. Some jurors raised their eyebrows, while others watching at home clenched their fists in anger. Several reporters immediately recorded the moment, for this wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration of arrogance that William Sterling didn't recognize the law. Evelyn didn't immediately respond. She simply observed him, her eyes deep and sharp like a sword waiting to strike. William Sterling was testing her, playing a psychological game, trying to prove he was the only one in control of the situation. She slammed the gavel down once, the sound echoing like a heavy blow to his arrogance. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice now more commanding, carrying the weight of an entire legal system. "The court demands that you cooperate in this process. If you continue to refuse to follow procedure, I will not hesitate to enforce measures." William Sterling narrowed his eyes, for the first time showing a flicker of discomfort. He wasn't used to being pushed into a corner, and certainly not used to a black woman giving him orders. But instead of yielding, he crossed his arms and tilted his chin up in defiance. "I have nothing to say," he shrugged, his voice calm but laced with challenge. "If you want to hear these meaningless words, then perhaps you should find someone else with more free time to turn this into a farce." This time, even those in the courtroom couldn't hide their disgust. Some jurors shook their heads, while reporters whispered about William Sterling's unacceptable arrogance. But Evelyn Hayes remained unshaken. She took a deep breath, leaned forward, and spoke, her voice now cutting through the room like a knife. "Mr. Sterling," she said slowly, emphasizing each word, "you can disregard me. You can disregard this room. But if you think you can disregard the law, then you've made the biggest mistake of your life." The room fell silent. William Sterling blinked. For the first time, something in his eyes softened slightly, as if he was realizing that the opponent before him was not as easily swayed as he had thought. Outside the courtroom, on social media platforms, a new wave began to rise. Videos of the trial were shared millions of times. Comments flooded forums. "Finally, someone who dares to stand up to him. I didn't know this judge before, but I'll be watching every second of this trial. Who does he think he is, saying that in front of the court? It's time to take him down." But deep within William Sterling's mind, a thought began to form slowly, a thought he had never accepted before. This time, perhaps he had truly met an adversary he couldn't easily crush. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, thick enough to be cut into pieces. Every eye in the room was locked on William Sterling, who had just brazenly refused to answer the court. But he wasn't done yet. He refused to be treated like an ordinary man. He couldn't stomach the idea of standing before someone he deemed beneath him. With a sharp, sudden motion, William slammed his hands onto the table, standing up so quickly that the chair behind him almost toppled. His eyes burned with a fury that was palpable, and his voice, once dripping with arrogance, now erupted with raw, unchecked rage. "Who the hell do you think you are, judging me?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "You're nothing but some black woman who climbed her way up to that seat through cheap political tricks. This system is so damn broken that it lets someone like you sit in judgment of me. A man like me bowing to a woman like you? Don't make me laugh." The room froze. The tension was so thick it was as though the air had solidified, and every person in that room felt the weight of his words. A deafening silence fell over the courtroom. No whispers, no nervous breaths. Just the shock and disgust written across every face. Some of the jurors were wide-eyed, struggling to process what they had just heard. Their collective disbelief was a silent scream, but no one dared to speak. James stood there, a giant in his own mind, radiating fury and arrogance. But Evelyn Hayes, unfazed and unflinching, remained seated. Her eyes, cold and steady, never left his. She had seen men like him before, men who believed their wealth, their privilege, and their power gave them the right to treat others as inferior. But this time was different. This time, he was not going to get away with it. William Sterling's smirk grew, twisting into a sneer as he paced around the room, eyes burning with contempt. "Look at you, sitting there, trying to act righteous, trying to act like you're some sort of strong figure. But what the hell do you know about real power?" He paused, as if savoring the moment, enjoying the sick pleasure of watching the world burn. "You're not me. You don't understand how this world works. You're a puppet being played by the politicians who want to turn me into their sacrificial lamb." The room was still, and the reporters, those who had been capturing the drama unfold, paused, their cameras flashing rapidly as they could hardly believe the spectacle playing out before them. William Sterling had made it clear. He was no longer hiding behind his usual facade of charm and calculated wealth. This was the true William Sterling, and he was letting the world see him for what he truly was. Outside the courtroom, a rumble began to stir among the crowd gathered in front of the large screens. The anger of the people was palpable. Shouts of shame and justice pierced the air as those watching from the streets and buildings were consumed by the venom in William Sterling's words. The undercurrent of society, those who had been crushed under the weight of men like him, began to rally together as they waited, desperate for a glimmer of justice. In the midst of the storm, Evelyn remained unwavering. Her gaze never shifted. Her expression never faltered. She was not just the judge today. She was the embodiment of justice itself, a reminder that power, no matter how vast, would never be above the law. William Sterling, still riding the high of his verbal assault, sneered. "Look at you, sitting there, trying to be the hero, trying to make yourself seem like something special. You're nothing but a pawn in this game. They'll use you to take me down, and when they're done with you, they'll cast you aside, just like they always do." Evelyn, calm as ever, gripped the gavel in her hand, feeling the weight of the moment, the weight of the eyes of the world both inside and outside the courtroom. She allowed William to continue, watching him expose every ounce of his arrogance, his belief that he could trample over anyone without consequence. But she had heard enough. Slowly, deliberately, she raised the gavel, her hand steady as she held it over the wooden bench. The silence in the room deepened, and in that charged moment, Evelyn's voice cut through the air like a blade. The sound of the gavel striking for the second time was like the crack of a starting gun, bringing an end to all the defiance William Sterling had been desperately trying to create. The courtroom fell silent. No more whispers, no more nervous glances exchanged. Everyone understood that no matter how powerful or wealthy he was, today he could no longer control the law as he once had. Evelyn Hayes looked down from the bench, her face emotionless, but her eyes filled with unwavering resolve. "Mr. Sterling, remain silent or leave here in handcuffs," she declared, her voice steady but resonant, like a sentence that could not be changed. William Sterling narrowed his eyes. His body stiffened as two officers moved toward him. He stood his ground, the suit worth tens of thousands of dollars no longer exuding the power it once had, instead highlighting his humiliating downfall. He gritted his teeth, trying to suppress his rage, but then, unable to hold it back any longer, he let out a hollow, mocking laugh. "You think you can drag me out of here?" he spat, his voice sharp and full of venom. His eyes darted across the jury box and the people in the room, searching for even a hint of support, but there was none. No one was on his side anymore. The officers didn't hesitate for a second. One grabbed his arm, the other seized his shoulder, and with a firm pull, they dragged him backward. William struggled, trying to wrench his hand free, but this time the situation was slipping out of his control. "Let go of me. You have no right," he roared, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. But his shouts changed nothing. In just a few seconds, he was dragged down the hallway, his shoes sliding on the polished wood, leaving behind a sight never before witnessed. An incredibly powerful billionaire, once the master of entire economies, now being hauled away like an ordinary criminal. Outside the courthouse, the crowd watching the live feed on large screens erupted. Cheers, angry shouts, and expressions of raw emotion flooded the scene. To the ordinary people watching, this was more than just a trial. It was a symbol, a moment where justice was no longer a privilege reserved for the wealthy. Social media exploded with posts, videos of him being dragged away, and millions of comments expressing satisfaction and hope. Those who had been crushed by William Sterling's greed for years, his victims, could now hold their heads high, knowing he was no longer untouchable. Evelyn Hayes didn't turn to watch as William Sterling was escorted out. She waited until the door closed behind him, the heavy footsteps of the officers fading away, before she scanned the courtroom. Some jurors nodded quietly. Some reporters scribbled faster than before, as if they had just witnessed a historic moment. But for Evelyn, this was only the beginning. She adjusted her posture, her hands firmly planted on the desk, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone in charge of justice. "We proceed," she said without hesitation. And with those words, she made one thing clear. No matter how much William Sterling struggled, no matter how hard he tried to wield his power, this time, justice would not be bent. The news exploded across every media outlet just hours after William Sterling was dragged out of the courtroom. But this time, it wasn't headlines about his downfall. Instead, the focus shifted to Evelyn Hayes, with blatant attacks on her character. Altered images of her appeared across Sterling-backed media channels, accompanied by sensational headlines. Judge Hayes making decisions based on racial prejudice? An orchestrated purge targeting wealthy white men. Articles flooded major newspapers, and television debate shows suddenly shifted their focus away from Sterling's criminal charges to question, is Evelyn Hayes truly fair? In a media office located on the top floor of a skyscraper, William Sterling reclined in his chair, his face filled with malicious satisfaction as he watched the news unfold just as he had hoped. He set his wine glass down on the table, a smug smile playing on his lips as he picked up the phone, his voice low but brimming with menace. Keep pushing. I want everyone to believe that I'm not guilty. I'm the victim of a political conspiracy. He paused for a moment, his eyes glinting with malice. And I want them to believe that that woman doesn't deserve to sit on the bench. His advisors nodded immediately, instructing the media team to amplify the story. Articles delved into every minute detail of Evelyn Hayes' past, analyzing every decision she had ever made, all pointing to one message. She is biased, unfit to oversee this case. Outside the courthouse, the media storm spread like a contagious disease, sparking heated debates. Some people began to question, was this trial really fair? Or was William Sterling right when he said he was just a businessman hunted by a biased system? But for those who had been following the trial from the beginning, especially the older viewers, they saw through the smokescreen. They didn't forget how he had humiliated the court, how he had arrogantly claimed he was above the law. But now he was playing the victim, turning justice into a cheap theater he thought he could still manipulate. The outrage surged across social media as videos of William Sterling being escorted out of the courtroom were shared millions of times, paired with comments expressing disgust. In a small cafe, a silver-haired man gripped his cup tightly as he watched the news on TV. Another rich bastard thinking he can buy the world, he muttered, his voice full of disdain. A middle-aged woman sitting beside him nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. But this time, he's made the mistake of going up against the right person. Elsewhere, Evelyn Hayes was watching the developments unfold, but she was unshaken. She knew what was happening. This wasn't just a trial. It was a battle not just between her and William Sterling, but between justice and the dirty forces behind him. And if he thought he could intimidate her with the media, then he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. Late one evening, with the lights still glowing in the judge's office, Evelyn Hayes sat at her desk, her eyes quickly scanning through the case files. The chill of the night outside was palpable, but within the walls of this room, a storm was brewing. This storm didn't come from the trial itself, but from a force that sought to extinguish justice before it had a chance to shine. A light knock on the door broke her concentration. Her assistant, Daniel, entered, holding a thick white envelope, unsealed and with no return address. Who sent this? Evelyn asked, but Daniel only shook his head. Someone left it at the door. There's no information. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she didn't show any sign of unease. Evelyn took the envelope, her hand steady, but her eyes darkening as she saw the contents. Inside was a neat white sheet of paper with one short, ominous sentence. Give up or die. Below it, a smear of ink appeared, as if someone had intentionally left a fingerprint, a warning without the need for further explanation. The room fell into silence. Daniel stood beside her, clearly having read what was written on the page. My God, he whispered, his voice tight with tension. We need to call the police right now. But Evelyn remained calm. She held the paper, turning it over in her hands, carefully considering the weight of the threat it carried. No, she said, her voice steady but slow. Call Thomas Lane for me. Daniel blinked in surprise. Thomas Lane? Thomas Lane, the head of the judicial security team, a man who feared nothing, who had handled countless threats against high-ranking officials in the past. If William Sterling thought he could make her back down with a piece of paper, he was sorely mistaken. Daniel didn't ask any more questions. He quickly grabbed his phone and left the room to make the call. Evelyn remained seated, still holding the note, but her gaze no longer lingered on it. She had known this was coming. When someone like William Sterling couldn't bribe anyone, he'd turn to the media. When the media wasn't enough, he'd use fear. And when fear failed, he'd resort to violence. But there was one thing he would never understand. Evelyn Hayes was not someone who could be easily intimidated. She had walked through hell to get to where she was, and a cheap threat would not stop her from doing what was right. She folded the paper neatly, placing it back on the desk as if it meant nothing at all. Outside the window, the city continued to move, and millions were still watching every twist of the trial. And she knew, no matter how strong the enemy, she could never turn back. Justice would not retreat, and neither would she. The news about the threat against Evelyn Hayes spread like wildfire, igniting a fierce debate across the globe. The media, social networks, online forums all became battlegrounds for an all-out war between two opposing viewpoints. On one side were the supporters of William Sterling, those who still believed that he was the victim of a biased legal system, that he had done nothing wrong but was targeted by a political conspiracy. They flooded the internet with defamatory articles about Evelyn, spreading baseless rumors about her past, constructing a narrative that she was merely a pawn of the shadowy forces wanting to bring down successful businessmen. They even created hashtags like Free Sterling and Justice for Sterling, attempting to make him a symbol against what they called the manipulation of the system. But on the other side, a wave of support for Evelyn Hayes began to rise. Those who had followed the trial from the beginning saw clearly the true nature of William Sterling, an arrogant man, disdainful of the law, willing to do anything to maintain his power. They saw Evelyn's resilience, a woman standing firm against every attack, from insults in the courtroom to dirty tricks outside the courthouse. Supportive posts flooded the internet, featuring images of the moment she banged the gavel for the second time, ordering William Sterling to be removed, accompanied by powerful captions. "We need more people like her in the judicial system. For the first time in my life, I've seen the law truly stand with the powerless." This isn't just a trial. It's a battle between justice and corruption. These posts were shared millions of times, and Evelyn Hayes quickly became a symbol of good fighting evil, of the oppressed rising to reclaim justice. The storm of public opinion was no longer in anyone's control. The world was watching, and for the first time in years, it seemed that money was no longer the ultimate weapon. Older viewers sitting in front of their screens, those who had long lost faith in the system, silently placed their trust in Evelyn Hayes. If anyone could defeat William Sterling, it was her. Inside his temporary holding cell, William Sterling leaned back in his chair, arms crossed in front of his chest, his smirk unshaken. The small, cold room around him seemed to have no effect on him, not even the slightest hint of concern. He sat there as if this were just an unwanted vacation, not the collapse of an empire. Across from him, Marcus Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face tense. "William, I really think you should prepare for the worst. The trial is turning against you, and the public is no longer on your side." But William just laughed, a sound full of arrogance and disdain. He shook his head, letting out a sarcastic sigh. "Marcus, have you forgotten who I am? I've gotten out of worse than this. They want to take me down? Not a chance." He shrugged, glancing around the small room with contempt. "This is all a farce. I'll get out of this. We both know how this system works. I've got money. I've got connections. When this is all over, I'll walk out of here, and they'll be kneeling before me." But this time, Marcus didn't share that confidence. He had seen William Sterling twist justice with money and power, but this time, things were beyond their control. He sighed, saying nothing more, but his mind began to realize that William Sterling was underestimating his opponent. Outside, the audience watching through the news felt more enraged than ever. They had seen William Sterling humiliate the court, humiliate the system, and now, even in custody, he still showed no remorse. For those who had lost everything because of him, nothing would satisfy them more than seeing him pay for his crimes. On the next trial day, the courtroom was packed. Millions of eyes were glued to the TV screens. Outside, the crowd grew larger, holding signs demanding justice. But no one was waiting for this moment more than Evelyn Hayes. She sat upright in the judge's chair, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk as she looked toward the prosecution team. Without needing to speak much, she motioned for them to proceed. Prosecutor Samuel Chen stood up, holding a thick stack of documents. He cleared his throat, looked straight at the jury, and spoke decisively. "Your Honor, the documents we are about to present will prove an undeniable truth. William Sterling didn't just break the law. He attempted to bribe a judge to escape justice." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Some of the jurors bit their lips in intense disbelief. Reporters hurriedly scribbled notes, and the defense stood frozen in stunned silence. Evelyn gave a subtle nod. "Proceed." Samuel opened the file, pulling out a series of internal emails, clear messages proving that William Sterling had tried to bribe another judge before his case was transferred to Evelyn Hayes. On the large screen in the courtroom, the messages appeared clearly. I need assurance that this verdict will disappear. Money is not an issue. I can handle everything as long as you play along. There will be $2 million US in the account if I get acquitted. No reason to refuse. The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers. Jurors exchanged looks, some taking deep breaths, trying to digest the truth. He hadn't just committed a crime. He had tried to bend the system to his will. In the defendant's seat, William Sterling froze. For the first time in this trial, he wasn't smiling anymore. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened as he looked up at the messages that clearly exposed his corruption. The media outside exploded. News outlets updated nonstop. William Sterling exposed. Bribery evidence shakes public opinion. Is this the end for Sterling? No way out. Truth finally comes to light. Evelyn looked directly at William Sterling, and for the first time in the entire trial, she allowed herself a brief smile, cold and sharp, like a verdict already sealed. Within hours of the evidence being revealed, the world turned its back on William Sterling. Media channels that had once supported him quickly backed off. No one dared to defend him anymore. The corporations that had once backed him quickly severed ties, and the stock prices of Sterling Industries plummeted without mercy. On social media, the outrage surged uncontrollably. Those who had once defended him now unanimously turned their backs, calling him a fraud, a betrayer of the system he had once manipulated. Images of William Sterling being dragged out of the courtroom, his face pale after the evidence was revealed, became the most shared photo of the day. Status updates flooded every platform. He thought he was above the law. Now he knows he was wrong. Justice has finally won. Evelyn Hayes has done it. No one is untouchable. No one. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted like crashing waves. The crowd gathered, chanting Evelyn Hayes' name. She hadn't just beaten William Sterling. She had become a symbol of the triumph of justice. In the courtroom, Evelyn banged the gavel down one more time, setting the date for the final verdict. But to all those watching, they knew one thing for sure. This battle was over. William Sterling had lost. The atmosphere in the courtroom was as heavy as a stone, pressing on the chest of everyone present. The day of the verdict had arrived, and this time, nothing could save William Sterling. He sat in the defendant's chair, but no longer with the perfect suit or the sneering smile that had once defined him. His face was pale, his neatly combed hair was slightly disheveled, and his eyes no longer held the familiar arrogance. Evelyn Hayes sat at the judge's bench, as calm as a statue carved from marble. She flipped through the final pages of the case files, her eyes scanning each line as if she were engraving them into her memory. The jury had completed its deliberation, and the prosecution had finished its presentation. Only one final step remained, the verdict. But before that could happen, William Sterling exploded in despair. He stood up suddenly, slamming his hands down on the table, his voice hoarse with anger. You can't do this. I am William Sterling. I built this system, and you're just a stupid woman sitting there thinking you can bring me down. Whispers spread through the courtroom, and the air grew heavy with tension. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others smirked with disdain. William Sterling, the man who once held the world in his hands, was now nothing more than a desperate criminal flailing in vain. But Evelyn didn't react, not even the slightest change in her expression. She simply lifted the gavel in her hand. Mr. Sterling, if you do not remain silent, I will instruct the police to remove you from this room again. William clenched his jaw, his hand trembling as he gripped the table. But this time, he knew there was no escape. The courtroom fell into a terrifying silence. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the decisive moment. Evelyn Hayes took a deep breath and looked directly at William Sterling. The jury had returned with their verdict, and she was the one to announce the final result. She picked up the file in front of her, her voice ringing out clearly, unwavering. After thoroughly reviewing the evidence, hearing testimony from witnesses, and carefully considering all aspects, the court finds the defendant, William Sterling, guilty of. A wave of emotions surged through the courtroom. Some people clapped, others sighed with relief, but everyone shared one feeling: satisfaction. Men like William Sterling had gotten away with their crimes too many times, but this time, justice was no longer manipulated. William froze, his lips trembled, but he couldn't utter a word. He glanced at Marcus Thorne, his lawyer, but even Thorne lowered his head, as if he had known all along that this result was inevitable. The officers moved forward, preparing to escort him out. The glint of the handcuffs reflected the lights in the courtroom, a symbol of his total downfall. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in joyous shouts, their cheers echoing throughout the city. Those who had lost everything because of him, the families he had driven to the brink of bankruptcy, the nameless victims all felt that at last, they had reclaimed a piece of the justice that had been stolen from them. Evelyn Hayes placed the gavel down on the desk, feeling the peace settle within her mind. She had done what needed to be done. As the trial ended, Evelyn Hayes stood up slowly, making her way toward the courthouse doors. The light from the setting sun streamed through the large window, casting a small halo around her. She walked out, head held high, her gaze unwavering, like a warrior emerging from her final battle. Outside, thousands waited. As the large doors opened, a thunderous applause erupted. Those who had watched the trial from start to finish cheered, waving banners that read, "Justice has triumphed, and no one is above the law." An elderly woman, her hair silver but her eyes still bright, watched the live broadcast from her home, her eyes slightly teary. She had seen too many men like William Sterling get away with their crimes. But today, she had witnessed something different, a glimmer of hope that the world could change, that justice could truly exist if there were those willing to fight for it. In a distant corner, William Sterling was being escorted into a police car. He lowered his head, no longer shouting, no longer demanding power. He had nothing left. Evelyn walked down the steps of the courthouse. Each step she took was a powerful statement. Injustice could exist. Power could buy a lot of things. But there would always be people who would not be bowed. And today, she had proven that justice could still prevail. Thank you all for staying with us through this incredible journey. This was more than just a courtroom battle. It was a fight for justice, a fight against corruption, and a reminder that no one is above the law. Evelyn Hayes stood her ground, and through her resilience, we witnessed a moment that shook the world. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in justice and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Emotional Journey. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and leave a lasting impact. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of these compelling stories. Let's keep this journey going together. Thank you, and see you in the next story.